Hey everyone, good evening. Roger here from the Expedition Project again. Thanks so much for joining us once again for another one of our live streams. Give us a quick shout, just sort of say that you're reading us loud and clear. Just do a little comment in the box, that'd be great. If you missed out on our last live stream, we've been sort of playing around with a new format that we hope you sort of enjoying, where we have some presentations from some of our projects and then also sort of get to interview some of our guests. Bring in some of our ambassadors and have a bit of interaction with some Q&A. So if you missed the last live stream, please do check that out and have a look and tell us what you thought. Tonight, we've got an interesting talk that we're going to be doing, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about soon. But just before we do get started, please do just authorize StreamYard via the link that's on the little top of this video, so that we can actually post your name as well as your comments and your questions as well while we're doing the sort of question and answer session in a little bit. So just if you authorize that, then we'll be able to post your name along with your question. That'd be great. Cool. So I think let's get underway. Let's introduce who we've got going on the live stream tonight. First up, let's say hello to Terry. Hey Terry.
Hello.
How are you doing? What are you up to these days?
Everything's well. So just going to introduce myself a little bit. My name, you gathered, is Terry. One of the ambassadors for the Expedition Project. My current focus, I'm busy with my master's degree, focusing on large carnivores, diet competition between all of them. And yeah, really excited for tonight's chat.
Amazing, amazing, cool. Thank you so much for joining us. And then very excited to bring in old friend, someone who I've not managed to see in quite a while. Let's say a big hello to Wendy. Hey, Wendy.
Hi, Roger. How you doing?
Good, good. You okay?
I'm very well, thank you.
It's so nice to have you live and really looking forward to your chat.
Thank you. No, thanks for having me.
Cool, cool. So Wendy's going to do a little chat for about sort of 20-25 minutes, see how we go with that. And then we're going to do some questions afterwards. So get your questions ready during Wendy's chat, and then we can do a little Q&A afterwards and see if you guys have any questions. But for now, very excited and just happy to hand over to Wendy. So all yours. The floor is yours, Wendy.
Great. Thanks, Roger, and thanks, Terry. Hi, everybody. I think I'm doing a slightly different type of talk. And Roger, you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think from a lot of the presentations that I've actually watched from the Expedition Project, you've mainly had a lot of your presenters sat in front of the screen talking. But I pleaded with Roger and said, look, my project is so unique that I actually do need to show some images. So you won't get to stare at me for the whole of the presentation. I'm going to show you some slides. but I do like to be very, very interactive. So I will be asking you questions. So even though you can't necessarily answer me, I actually want you to think in your head of the answer, or if you are sat there with somebody and you're sat next to them and you're there in your lockdown, you can shout the answer to each other. So I still want you to interact, even though you might not be able to shout at me the answers, but yeah, I will be asking a few questions. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Roger and I did try this earlier, so I hope I get this right. Roger, you're going to have to tell me that I have definitely got it up.
Yeah, I'll tell you as soon as you're ready. Okay.
Okay. Am I up?
We're all up and ready to go. Go for it.
Okay, so the title of our presentation this evening, it's a little bit ambiguous. I don't like to give too much away. So it's Animals, Camera, Action. And it's a research project that I've been working on for the last couple of years in South Africa. And I'm going to take you through some of the things that we're doing and some of the findings, and then ask you for your opinions. So firstly, Roger, I just want to thank you for inviting the Endangered Wildlife Trust to do this live stream. I think you know me well enough that I love talking, I love engaging with people, so I really, really appreciate the opportunity. Okay, who am I though? For those of you listening in from the UK, you're probably thinking, she sounds very, very English. Well, that's because I am. I'm originally from the UK. I left the UK about 16, 17 years ago. And believe it or not, I used to be a sports teacher in the East End of London. So my first degree is actually in education, and specifically physical education. And bizarrely, I got to a point in my life, I mean, I've been teaching for 15 years. I got to a point where I'd been doing lots of traveling around the world. And as awful as it sounds to say this, I got bored of being a tourist. And I wanted to go and try and do something different with my life, and not necessarily just go and teach in another country, but to have a complete career change. So I resigned from teaching and I left all my family in the UK. It's my lovely family that are all still back in the UK. And I originally just went to South Africa for 3 months. But there's a saying, Africa gets underneath your skin. And my 3 months then turned into 17 years. Now, I cut my teeth, and this is interesting with regards to the work that Terry is doing for her master's degree. I actually cut my teeth working with large carnivores in the north of the country. And at that time, I was a research assistant working with the Endangered Wildlife Trust. And it was whilst I was working with these wild carnivores and doing a lot of driving around that I started to notice a number of dead animals on the roads. And this is why I specifically said to Roger that I really wanted to do some slide presentations rather than you just having to stare at my face, because it's quite a difficult or challenging subject to talk about without the images. Now, I'm not going to show you lots of images of dead animals. That's not what this presentation is about. It's actually about the positive and how we can reduce animals being killed on roads. So, like Terry, I did my master's degree, and mine was specifically on numbers of animals being killed on the roads and some of the reasons for it. And now I'm busy with my PhD. But just to sort of finish a little bit of the background of how everything slots together, well, when I was working on my master's up in the north of South Africa, that was when I bumped into Roger. And I think, Roger, that was 2012. And here's a picture of me and Roger. I think Roger's got slightly more hair in this picture. And there's one of the project vehicles that I was working with alongside the expedition project. So that's kind of my background and how I ended up here. So I think most of you are familiar with South Africa and whereabouts it is. Believe it or not, sometimes I've done a few presentations, and when I tell people I'm from South Africa, they then say, but where in South Africa? Meaning as in, they don't realise that South Africa is actually a country. They think it's the south of Africa. But to be a little bit more specific, this is actually where I live. I live right up in the far, far north. So basically on the border of Botswana and Zimbabwe in the far northern province called Limpopo. And just a little bit of background about the country. I think it's always interesting and useful to know, particularly for the people who are in the UK. So South Africa, even though it's a bigger country than the UK actually has a bigger population. We have approximately 59 million, the UK is 66 million. We have 11 different languages, and whilst there's obviously only one language in the UK, you could actually argue that some of those languages or the English language does vary a bit depending on the dialect. 9 provinces, it's the 24th largest country in the world, and the road network is almost 370,000 kilometres of paved road versus the UK, which is 422,000. But notice I say that's just paved roads. It's almost double if you include the dirt roads, which South Africa has a substantial amount. And there's a reason why I'm talking about roads, because that's obviously the main reason why animals get killed on roads. So just very quickly, who is the Endangered Wildlife Trust? So this is the organisation that I work for. It's a South African NGO, that's a non-government organisation. And we operate primarily in Southern Africa. So not just in South Africa, but also in Botswana, Zambia, and we do have a number of projects up in East Africa as well. And our logo, this is where it gets interesting. And those of you who have got cats and dogs, this is where you can go and look at their feet. I wonder if any of you know what footprint this animal is, because this is the EWT's logo. So if any of you are shouting at the screen now, this is one of your chances. So this is actually a cheetah footprint for the EWT. And the reason why it's a cheetah footprint is it was a cheetah project, which was the very, very first project that the Endangered Wildlife Trust started with back in 1973. Just so you can see the difference between a cat and a dog, this footprint on the right-hand side, that's a dog. And just look at the 2 main differences. This is just a little bit of a geeky fact for you. The 2 main differences is to do with that lower lobe. Can you see the EWT cheetah paw, how it's got those 3 lobes at the bottom, and then the dog has the 2 lobes? So those of you who have got cats and dogs, I'm sure after this presentation, you can rush off and grab your animal's paw and you'll see whether it's a cat or a dog. And again, I think Terry will back me up on this thing, as she's also doing carnivore work. So that's who the Endangered Wildlife Trust is, or EWT as we're known for short. So at the EWT, I am actually responsible for the Wildlife and Transport Programme, and primarily looking at the impacts of transportation on wildlife. So when I say transportation, I'm specifically talking about roads, railways, ships and aircraft. Why do we need transport? I mean, I think this is a fairly easy question to answer, but just have a think in your head. Why do we need cars? Why do we need rail, aircraft, trucks and cargo ships, or even cruise ships? And the main reason why we need transport is in any society where you want to develop your economy, the transfer of goods and people is critical. And it's a very interesting period that we're all in at the moment with the COVID-19 situation and the fact that much of our transport systems have come to a grinding halt, and the impact that is having on our economies. So it's just showing that transport systems are critical, but there are negative consequences, particularly for biodiversity or wildlife. So the way we like to think of this is that there are two types of negative consequence, either a direct impact or an indirect impact. So maybe just have a little think here in your own heads before I start to show you some of the answers. What do you think would be a negative impact of a vehicle on a road, besides roadkill, which is what I've already mentioned earlier, which was my main area of research? What other things can you foresee being interacting negatively on wildlife? So we've already said a direct impact could be a collision. So in this case, we've got an aircraft taking off and it's flying into birds. And if you think about those birds flying into the engines, potentially that can have substantial damage to the aircraft. And then the work that I'm primarily doing, which is on roads, a direct impact is a collision with a vehicle. But what about the indirect impacts? These are less obvious and often things that people don't generally think about, particularly as it's not as visual as a roadkill image. So let's see if you've got any of these right. An indirect impact could be a vehicle emission. So the carbon monoxide that comes out of vehicles can have significant impact not only on plants next to the roadside, but also your actual wildlife. Roads and railways act as barriers. So very often where a road is built, that will, in some cases, prevent an animal from being able to cross the road. Or if it does cross the road, it then gets run over. And then this is quite interesting. I've put a picture of a frog up here, but I could have also put a bird. Many animals have actually altered their behaviour in response to roads. So if you think about roads today, there's lots and lots of traffic on the roads. It can be very, very noisy. And because of that noise, effectively, that's creating a barrier and an animal won't cross the road. And what we've started to notice is that some species are actually evolving or adapting their behaviour in response to traffic noise. So a frog and a bird, but a frog which will use a specific call as its mating call has managed to adapt its actual type of call so that it can still be heard over the traffic and therefore attract its mate. So some animals are actually evolving with the negative consequences and others aren't, and ultimately it potentially is significantly impacting their population. So the most obvious impact of roads is roadkill, which is, as I said, the most visual, probably what you see more often, and my main area of specialism. And if we think about it from the business side of things, it's all well and good an animal being run over on the road, but what about the consequences for us? So if you hit a small frog, it's very unlikely to damage your vehicle, and unless you swerve, you're unlikely to be injured. But if you hit a larger animal, so if you hit an antelope, or in the UK a deer or a badger, that's going to have quite significant damage potentially for your vehicle, which would then affect your insurance claim. If it's very, very large animal, potentially you might be injured and have to go to hospital, or worst case scenario, there's actually deaths to the vehicle occupants. If there are a number of vehicles involved, then potentially the road might be closed. And then you think about the consequences of that, where you have trucks on the road that have deadlines to get their goods from A to B. So the road closure is causing companies to lose business. So just through hitting one animal on the road can cause the economy a significant amount of money. So just to give you an idea here, in the UK, around £65 billion is spent on accident insurance claims in South Africa, of which about a third of that is due to animals colliding with vehicles. So it's not just about preventing an animal from being killed on the road. We also want to make roads safer for human beings as well, and this is certainly the business case. All right, question time. How many of you have been in a vehicle when you have hit an animal? Now, I know I can't see you, but I can probably guarantee there's about half of you with your hands up, and the other half are thinking, no, you've never been in a vehicle when something has been hit on the road. So I just want to reword that question a little bit. What about being in the vehicle when you have hit an insect, a butterfly? There's something splattered on your windscreen. So I'm going to ask you that question again. How many of you have been in a car when you have hit an animal or an insect on the road? And I would expect all of you to have your hands up. Now, this is what gets interesting, because a lot of people don't actually consider small species such as insects as roadkill. A lot of people only consider larger animals that cause damage to your vehicle as a roadkill. So when we start putting it into perspective that anything that is hit by a transportation system, be it aircraft, be it the railway, the trains, be it cars, if it's small insects, that could still potentially impact populations. Just to give you an example, let's think about butterflies when they migrate at various times of the year. We have quite large migrations of butterfly in South Africa, and you see them in their thousands moving from one part of the country to the other. Now, if you've got an endangered species of butterfly and they're flying across the road and they keep being hit, what impact is that having on that population? And this is what people don't actually realise, that just because it's a small species, it doesn't matter. But of course it does. So let's just try and put things into perspective with regard to our road network. So worldwide, there are approximately 750 million vehicles on approximately 50 million kilometres of public road. Well, that's kind of a bit meaningless, because when we start talking in figures of millions of kilometres, I mean, that's meaningless. What does it mean? So to put it into perspective, the network of roads that we have on the planet, if we join them all up together, that would be about 2,200 times around the equator. That's an awful lot of fuel, and that's a significant amount of roads on our planet. So what are we actually doing globally and at the Endangered Wildlife Trust to understand what roadkill is and how we can solve the problem of it? And this is where I'm now going to take you into one of our projects, and also a story of hope and how we can fix something that is potentially having huge impacts on biodiversity. So I think we might just have a quick break here, and then I'll start sharing some of the work that we're actually doing. And what I've really done here is just giving you a background to who I am and what the problem is. So over to you, Roger.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Wendy. Great first half. So just a reminder that we're going to be moving over to questions and a little bit of an interview for Wendy shortly when she continues with the second half. But for now, let's just have a little break and just show you something else. And then we're going to get back to Wendy in a second. Cool. Okay, so back to you, Wendy. That was short and sweet. So just a reminder, get your questions ready and you can start posting them so we can build up some questions for Wendy in a minute. But yeah, back to you, Wendy.
Great. Thanks, Roger. I just want to check that my screen is still sharing.
It's all still good, looking perfect.
Yeah, so you can see my giraffe.
we can still see your giraffes. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, great. All right, so back to the question then. What are we doing to try and understand the problem and how are we fixing it? So what we're actually doing in South Africa, but it's also being done on a global scale, is to firstly gather the information. Now, if we think about how extensive a road network is, it's not physically possible to drive every single road in the country or even on the planet. So we rely very much on training people to gather this data for us and also ask volunteers to help. So these are some examples of some of the work that's being done elsewhere in the world. So in the UK, they have a research project based at Cardiff University called Project Splatter. And in the United States, they have, again, from the UC Davis University, a project called the California Roadkill Observation System. And what these teams do in the States and the UK is that they encourage members of the public to send through any roadkill that they see on the roads, and they build up a map of everything that they see happening. So we have a similar system in South Africa. We actually train staff to go out en route and some of the highways and gather this information for us. So it's often gathered on a daily basis. We also train people in how to identify some of the species. So the image you see on the left there is a field guide, and next to it there's a terrapin, and we train these guys how to use the field guides correctly. We also have a cell phone app which can be downloaded. Actually, this does work globally. So very often we have people in the United States to the UK using this app and sending in their reports. So members of the public can report information to us. And as a result of this information, this is what we end up with. So notice I call this roadkill reports, because reports are very, very different to scientific research. Because if you've got a scientist out there who's driving the road every single day through all the different types of seasons, that's very robust information. If you've got a member of the public who's only reporting every so often, and they're not reporting small things, but they're recording only big things, then the data is slightly biased. But what this does allow us to do through these reports coming in from members of the public is to give us a snapshot of the potential areas where there may be problems, and then we get students to go in and do more robust research. So you can see from this map, there's some very, very dark areas where the road network is. That's where there's been a substantial amount of roadkill reported. And then there's some roads that haven't got anything. Now, that doesn't mean to say there's no roadkill happening. It's possibly due to there being very few roads in that area, or very few people actually driving in that area. So once we've got this information, what do we do with it? So this is now where I get to tell you the story. So I've just circled this road here. This is one of our major highways in South Africa. Any of you have travelled to South Africa? I'm not sure if you know this one and whether you can remember it. It goes from Johannesburg out to Durban, and it's our N3 highway, one of our major routes. So from all that data that we just go back to it, you see it's very, very black. What we can do is we can turn it into what we call a heat map, or we can start to identify what we call a hotspot where most roadkill is happening. So if we look at that map on the left, you can see all those bright red areas are where most animals get hit, and the lighter yellow areas are where there's less happening. So what we would do in this instance is potentially look at what animals are being hit and get researchers to focus on these target areas. So just with regards to animal behaviour, we know a number of things about them. Some animals will cross the road regardless, and they'll either make it across safely or they die. Some animals we know will actually avoid the road altogether. So if there's too much traffic or it's too noisy, some animals will therefore choose not to cross and they'll turn around. And this goes back to me mentioning earlier about one of the negative consequences where a road acts as a barrier. This is exactly that example. The animal avoids the road altogether. So we've got these two cases, or there is a third scenario. Some animals will look for other options. And this is where our story begins. Why cross the road in the first place? Well, if we think about it, the animals were there before the road. So when the road was constructed, it would have gone through part of an animal's home range or territory. So because you've got this home range or this area that is part of any animal's territory, they will naturally continue to use that, whether the road is there or not. And that's often to their demise. Another reason why an animal might cross the road is because it's part of their migration. I used the example earlier of butterflies who will fly in one direction at a particular time of year, but it's part of their migratory route. And if it happens to cross the road, again, it's often to that species' demise. Again, an animal may choose to cross the road because it's part of its breeding period. Just one example here, chameleons, which is a species that I'm sure we're all very familiar with. Chameleons normally live in trees, i.e. it's an arboreal species, and the only time they come down from the trees is when they want to breed. So the poor old males come down from the trees, they walk very slowly across the road to go and find their girlfriends, and often that's when they get squashed. So that's an example of a species that hasn't adapted to crossing the road successfully. And here are some examples from around the world. It's not just South Africa that we're talking about, as I mentioned earlier. It is a global problem. So you'll see here in the top middle picture, there's an image of bears. Well, we don't have bears in South Africa. And again, in the bottom middle, there's a kangaroo. We don't have kangaroos here. So all over the world, animals will try and cross that road, either there to their demise, or they just won't cross it at all because they'll avoid it. So like I said, roads effectively do create a barrier. And what I find interesting is that I think we can all directly relate to this barrier situation at the moment. The COVID-19 virus has ultimately caused a barrier between us and many of our loved ones. And depending on the country that you're in, there are various types of barriers. Some people are allowed to interact, or some aren't even allowed out of their houses. Currently in South Africa, we are still supposed to be indoors. And if we did go out to the shops, we had to maintain a social distance. So a road is effectively like the situation that the COVID-19 virus is causing for us as human beings at the moment. So given that we are talking about the negative side of roads, what can we do? So this is where our story begins. Every single road in every have what we call underpasses or storm drains. So even though you might not have noticed these, every road that you drive on, you'll always see something like this. Now, these underpasses are either designed for pedestrians to cross, or the storm drain, which is the image on the right-hand side, is often used for the hydrolysis, so to ensure that the road doesn't get flooded. So rather than the water going onto the road, it would go through the storm drain. Now, if you look really, really closely at that picture on the right-hand side with the storm drain, I wonder how many of you can see that little antelope, the little duiker. And it's probably about 2 meters away to the right of the storm drain. It's very, very disguised, but there's a little antelope standing there. that antelope actually used that storm drain to travel underneath the road, which is quite clever. So given that we suspect animals are using alternative options to cross the road, which takes me back to that earlier point that I mentioned, this one here, some animals will look for other options. Well, this is the other options that they are seeking. They're using the natural underpasses to cross. So just to do a little bit more investigating, these are some footprints that we actually found in some of the tunnels underneath the roads. And we also found this. I wonder how many of you know what animal this comes from. It's a single quill. Yeah, has anybody guessed it? The porcupine. So we know that porcupines are using some of these underpasses. So based on this evidence, we looked at some work that had been done in other countries. And this is an underpass in the United States where we see that there's actually some deer crossing. This is an example from Kenya where they've actually got elephants going underneath the road. And I think that's a pretty good idea to have elephants actually doing that, because even if a truck hits an elephant, the truck is definitely going to come worse off. More examples, this is the United States, the bear using an underpass, and even cows. So we have livestock making use of the underpasses. This is from Cape Town. We've got penguins going through the storm drains. And I love this one. This is an owl actually going into the underpass. I suspect there was actually a rodent there and the owl was actually scavenging. But even so, it's really interesting, the wildlife that are naturally choosing to use these man-made structures to get across the road safely. Effectively, they are evolving their behaviour for something that's there. So it's all well and good us saying this, but as a scientist, we need strong information as to what's really going on, rather than just saying, oh, this is interesting, this animal we think is using these tunnels. We actually need to gather more robust data. So we're using camera traps. Now, most of us are probably all familiar with the snappy camera that we use. Those of you who have actually come to Africa and you've been on safari, you've probably got some amazing pictures of wildlife that you've taken with your digital cameras. But I can imagine many of you get very frustrated that you're standing there and you're lining up your shot. You think you've got a great picture and suddenly the animal moves because another human being that was close by maybe made a noise, or they moved and disturbed the wildlife. So this isn't ideal for capturing animal behaviour in its natural environment, because just through your presence, you would be biasing the animal behaviour. So we use camera traps. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with these, but these are camera devices that can be attached to trees or walls, and they react on a motion sensor. So every time something passes the camera, the camera will go off. They're also very, very sensitive, and you have to be quite creative on how you set the sensitivity of the camera trap up, because if it's too sensitive, you'll end up with 1,000 images of a strand of grass blowing back and forth. They're that sensitive to any type of movement. So we are working with these camera traps. This is a lovely example from the United States where they've been using camera traps. They've picked up an image of the Florida panther walking around at night. Now, I mean, this would be a privilege to see this, and this was caught on a camera trap. So, I mean, they're already used very often in the field. I'm sure when we chat to Terry later, I would imagine Terry would be using something like this to actually try and get some carnival images. So it's a very, very common method that wildlife biologists actually use for gathering wildlife information. But what we're actually interested in is having eyes underneath the road. So we are using our camera traps to actually see what animals are using the underpasses. Now you'll see here that the camera trap is actually a little bit different to the camera that you actually see here. This is the raw camera, but what you see here is the camera, and it's enclosed in a steel box, padlocked and actually drilled into the wall. This is because it's in a public area, and as with anything, when something is left out in public, it often goes missing. So we've had to be very creative with our camera traps to make sure that they don't get stolen. So this is one of my field workers on the left-hand side there, that's innocent, and he's training some staff in how to attach the cameras. And this was one of the images that we caught on the cameras, where you see that there are some inquisitive people around. And we did actually lose one of our cameras because it wasn't secured enough. So we're having to think of quite creative methods to deter theft. So one of the things that we've come up with is to not only secure the camera traps more robustly in their steel boxes, but actually to use what's there already. Now, I wonder how many of you know what these are. These are nests that are underneath the bridges. You will find them in the UK. You'll probably find them all over the world. And they belong to swallows. So this is actually the European swallow. So these birds actually migrate between South Africa and Europe. And these are their nests underneath the underpasses, underneath the road. So what we thought is that we would hide one of our cameras in one of these nests, but of course we don't actually want to put it in the actual swallow's nest because that's invasive. So we are making our own nests, and then we will hide our cameras in it. And then another thing we've also tried is sticking these stickers onto our steel boxes, warning people that if they touch them, they'll get electrocuted. So that's actually proved a very successful deterrent as well. And so far we haven't lost any cameras since that one occasion. So now that we've managed to get our cameras out underneath the highway, what have we found? What animals are using them? Anybody know what these are? Okay, these are guinea fowl. It's a very, very common species that get killed on roads. They often wander around in flocks. So here we see a small flock of guinea fowl heading towards the underpass. Any ideas what this is? Okay, this is a mongoose. We have a number of mongoose species in South Africa, and this is one of them. What about this? Any ideas? Okay, it's a domestic cat, or it could be a feral cat. We don't actually know, but it's a domestic species. And here, this is one of our barn swallows or European swallows. These are these little guys that actually nest in the tunnels. They're set on the ground here. And remember I showed you earlier that quill lying on the ground? Well, here is the porcupine using one of the underpasses. And what's interesting about this guy is we know from the cameras, because we can set the actual date and time, this guy goes across underneath the road in the morning about 10 o'clock, and then in the afternoon he comes back about 4 o'clock. So it's really interesting behavior that we're learning about the animals as well. Here's another one, and you can see that it's not always so easy to identify. Anybody got any ideas what animal this is? I think this is a really, really tough one. It's a serval, and I wonder how many of you have actually been privileged to see one of these. They're very small carnivores, they're very shy, they're very elusive, and unfortunately, they are very common roadkill. We've actually had almost 250 killed on the N3 highway, which, as I told you earlier, which is the highway that goes from Johannesburg out to Durban. We've had almost 250 killed over a 3-year period. So the fact that some of them are actually going underneath the road is promising, and therefore hopefully not as many are being killed. And as I mentioned to you earlier, some of the camera traps are incredibly sensitive. So you'll see in the image on the left there's absolutely no animal at all, but there must have been something that actually triggered the camera to take a photograph. So very often when we download all our camera images, we can have thousands of images, and in those 1,000-odd images, there may only be 3 or 4 pictures of animals. So it's quite a time-consuming job, but it's certainly worthwhile because we're really starting to understand what's going on. And you'll see on the right-hand side there that that's a picture of a striped mouse. So the cameras are very, very good at picking up smaller species as well. And just moving on to other projects, cameras are being used not just in underpasses to understand animal behaviour crossing the roads, but also over the roads as well. So this is a project that's happening quite close to me for Samango monkey. This is a primate species that's listed as vulnerable in South Africa, and they live in trees. Now, unfortunately, when a road goes up, very often the canopy over a road is cut, because you can't have branches over a road because it's going to fall onto the road and obviously damage or, potentially cause an accident. So with these animals that naturally move across in using the canopies, they can't migrate across the road. So what happens is they either come down from the trees, cross the road on foot and then get run over, or some of them try and use electricity lines to cross the road and then get electrocuted. So what we found with these monkeys is that if we just put a bamboo pole across the road, the monkeys will just walk across the pole safely. And all these images that we have here were captured using a camera trap. Here's an example from from Australia. That was a rope bridge put across the road and a camera trap was put up. And this rope bridge was specifically put up there to save possums that were being killed on the road. But look at this, look what the camera trap picked up. So as well as possums using this, we actually find that there was an iguana using these rope bridges to cross the road, which is pretty amazing. And then there are other types of animal crossing. So this is ultimately the direction that we want to be moving in. So through our understanding of our camera traps, we can have different types of crossings that go underneath the road. So in addition to the underpasses that are already there, we can add other ones. This one would be totally appropriate for small amphibians or small or rodents. And then in addition to an underpass, you can also have overpasses. These are examples from North America where you'll see that there's a bridge that goes across the road, not designed for human beings, but specifically for wildlife. So it's connecting habitat. And to test that these overpasses are working, there would be camera traps set up to see what animals would be using them. And this is a fantastic example from Holland, where you'll actually see that this overpass actually crosses multiple types of transportation. You've actually got a canal, you've got a railway line, you've got a road, and you've also got a power line. So that would be have serious impacts on wildlife attempting to get from one side of the habitat to the other. So this is an awesome example from Holland. And this is ultimately something that we're aiming to do in South Africa, using culverts under the road. At the moment, we're in the experimental stage, so we've got temporary roadside fencing up. And ultimately, we want to work towards having permanent fencing that will force animals to go underneath the road rather than on it. And so therefore, we're looking at a win-win. It's a win-win for the driver because there'll be less collisions on the road, less injuries, less mortalities to human beings, insurance claims should go down. And happier animals because they will be protected and not being killed on the roads. And of course, we couldn't do this without the members of the public that help us. And it's not just in South Africa. There are multiple projects throughout the world that are working on trying to reduce the impacts of roads. And with that, I would just like to thank you for listening to my presentation. For any of you who I don't get around to answering all your questions, or you think of a question later, this is my email address and you are more than welcome to contact me. And again, I would just like to say thank you to Roger and the Expedition Project for inviting me to do the presentation. And I look forward to answering any questions if we have time.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Brilliant, brilliant, super, super interesting. We have had some questions that are slowly coming in through their presentation, but I think maybe should we kick off with Terry? Do you want to start with some of your questions?
Yes, definitely. Thanks so much. That was actually very, very interesting. I enjoyed it. Looking forward to seeing what the solutions are going to be and how they work. One random thing. What is the most unexpected animal you've found using the underground coverts?
I actually think the serval, only because so many of them were being killed on the roads that I didn't expect them to be using the underpasses. So yeah, in that respect, it was sort of going against the grain. And also the owl as well. I mean, why would a bird attempt a crossing? But I mean, I suspect it was because there was something to scavenge in there. I mean, a bird wouldn't naturally use it. So birds are quite challenging to find solutions for successful crossing. So if they are actually using those underpasses, then that's awesome, but only time will tell. Now, thanks for that, Terry.
Okay,
have you found it's a bit of, sorry, one more. Have you found it's a bit of everything trying to use the underground tunnels, or is it specific species or more anything that fits?
Yeah, at the moment, what we're trying to do is look at apples with apples. So when I say that, it's there's various vegetation types adjacent to the road. So in some places there's agricultural sections, in other places you've got natural wetland areas. So we're trying to compare various habitats along the different sections. So we wouldn't have cameras set up in an agricultural area and then 20 kilometres up the road have them in a wetland area. We're trying to keep, standardise our way of monitoring. And as time goes on, and we need to purchase more camera traps because we are still in the preliminary stage of trying to find out what's going on. We'll be able to start shifting them around a little bit more. And we've only really been going we've been working on it for the last 8 months, but we found a lot of restrictions with gathering our information because of the current shutdown with the country. So it's one of those frustrating projects that we've got so much we should be doing, and we already wanted to put up that roadside fencing to actually be funneling animals towards it, but we haven't been able to implement that at this stage. So yeah, at the moment we're just seeing what's coming through at the moment, and hopefully when the lockdown's lifted we'll be able to move forward a little bit more on the research.
So I got a question, well, more of a comment and a question that came in from Tanya. She says animals must be loving so much now with sort of less pollution, less cars and stuff like that. It's funny because I was thinking exactly the same thing while you were talking. So is that true?
I think this is a fantastic question, and despite the global pandemic and the stress that it's causing to many of us, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to actually gather some incredibly valuable information. I mean, when are we ever going to be in a situation where we see traffic numbers reduced and be able to look at before and after data? So what I mean by that is we know that there's pollution problems. We know that animals are being killed on roads. But now the traffic volumes have gone down. We would expect to see a reduction in roadkill. We would expect to see less plants by the roadside impacted by pollution. And I think, a case for example of that is that we are seeing a number of images from around the world. And yeah, a few of them are false news, but a lot of them, you actually see images of cities, don't you, where the pollution has reduced. And I think it's going to be exciting data from a scientific side. And I am looking forward to getting my hands on that roadkill data once the lockdown is lifted. And just to sort of continue from what Tanya's sort of asked, what we've noticed already from the data that's still being submitted to us is that we are starting to see animals that we would not normally have seen around roads before. So when I mentioned in my presentation about animals that avoid roads, there's animals now that used to avoid them that are now hanging around the roads. And we've also had reports about animals being seen in cities where they would previously not have been seen before. So I think the whole planet is changing. Animals are getting more confident about their movements. And what's going to be interesting is when traffic numbers resume, or when we get back to having more people back on the streets, what will happen to that wildlife? Will they readapt their behavior, or will they continue and put themselves at threat? I mean, it's a lovely question, Tanya, which I could sort of elaborate on even more and more, but I think it really does open a huge debate, not just from the research that I'm doing, but from many, many other research fields. It's going to be interesting times.
And similar from Emily in Toronto, obviously noticing a lot more going on. So just sort of following on from what you've said, very, very sort of interesting, actually. Let's have a look what other questions we got. So Richard says, do you do sort of community outreach in schools as well as what you do?
Yes. No, I mean, it's critical that you get into the grassroots. And when I talk about grassroots, it is the schools, because at the end of the day, we can gather all this information about the causes of why animals get killed on roads, and we can put in measures to reduce them. But the reason why animals are being killed is because of the way that people drive. So if you can start to re-educate people about improving their driver behaviour, and that might not necessarily be the adults, it's the kids that you need to reach, because they're the ones that are going to be in the car with their parents saying, Dad, slow down, we're driving through a wildlife area, or they're going to be what you call the guardians of the future, who are going to be more responsible in their efforts. So yes, we do try and get out into the schools, and the Endangered Wildlife Trust does have specifically a program devoted to solely working with communities, and they kind of umbrella a lot of the other EWT programs. So whilst myself, I don't deal with communities specifically, I cross-collaborate with other EWT programs that do, and they help me with some of my community work.
Okay. Terry, do you have anything else you want to ask? Anything else that's popped up?
Yes. What areas do you find you need more sort of citizen scientist volunteers in South Africa or in Southern Africa?
Definitely the Western Cape. I think you would have seen from that map, there's very few reports, and we know there's an awful lot happening over there. And we're talking about Africa in general. I would say West Africa. We've got very little information from there in general. And I would certainly say from a wildlife perspective, irrespective of the field that I work in, from a wildlife research side, definitely West Africa. And certainly one of my areas of huge concern, and it's very difficult to get this data, is the Central Africa area. So the Congo Basin, basically the area where there's a lot of extensive logging going on, a lot of illegal poaching. And the reason why a lot of this is happening is because there's these roads that are being built to get into the areas where the logging is happening. So we're losing vegetation. These roads are creating avenues for poachers to go in, and it's all going on under the radar. And by the time anything's done, it's going to be too late. So for me, I mean, yes, it's difficult to get the public involved in that area with regards to information, gathering information. I think information for that is more on a global scale, because, this is, if we can also look at the Amazon basin, for example, they've got similar problems with logging. So, it's bigger than just roadkill. That's, it's dealing with more of a global climate issue. That's
Sure.
a bit pressing.
No. But it's a topic that can, there's so much we can actually speak about in this, isn't it? It's actually fascinating, and really have enjoyed your presentation. There's another one that's come in from Tanya. Which animals most affected?
Oh, good question. Okay, so it does vary from taxonomic group to group. And when I say taxonomic group, we're talking about mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians. So probably one of the most effective mammals in South Africa is what is known as the scrub hare. So, I mean, it's a common rabbit, if for those of you who don't know what a scrub hare is. They're pretty abundant. And, we've all heard the expression, breeding like rabbits. There's lots of them. And because of their behaviour, they often run into the road and they get blinded by the headlights, and then they go looking for shadows. And the way they behave is they sort of do this zigzagging on the road to try and get away from the headlights. And then when they do get caught in the headlights, they then stand there stunned, and that's when they get hit. So that's probably one of the most common ones. And sadly, because they're so common and abundant, people aren't really interested in saving them. So my concern is, what about 20 years down the line, when these scrub hares have been hit so many times on the roads, and combined with other threats such as maybe poisoning or loss of habitat, loss of their habitat, it could actually be a species that goes extinct in the future, purely because we don't care about it at the moment because they're so abundant. So that's probably one of the most common mammals. And then birds, you saw the image of those guinea fowls. That's a very, very common bird species. They generally walk around in flocks. They're terrestrial. So, yes, they can fly, but they generally walk around, and they are pretty stupid. They get onto the road and they don't know.
Traffic rather than anything, don't they? I see sometimes.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Okay, I think maybe, Terry, do you have anything else you want to ask to sort of round this up?
Yes, you mentioned a training program sort of for the members of the team. Do you do any roadkill training for people in the public?
We try to. So, I mean, this is a great opportunity to reach people through online interaction. And it's quite interesting that the pandemic is causing us to interact more online, but it's something that we've been doing quite regularly at EWT, where we make little videos showing people how to do things. I mean, I have got a number of short, and when I say short, I mean, we've sort of gone into an hour here, so it's certainly, you don't have to sit there for an hour listening to my explanation of how to collect data. I mean, it's literally like a 3-minute, okay, this is how you do it. So we do encourage people. Our cell phone app helps people with identification. So yeah, there's a lot of awareness materials out there. It's just about getting buy-in, because, and this goes back to my chat with you the other day, Roger, as to why I said I really wanted to do a slideshow, because, I mean, let's face it, roadkill isn't sexy. Terry is doing sexy research. She's working with carnivores. Everybody wants to hear about the carnivores. Nobody actually wants to hear about a dead animal. So, that's why I really wanted to do an actual slide presentation, because I think as soon as someone hears about mortalities, it turns them off. So yeah, I do a lot of public awareness raising, Terry, and try and help people with the training, but it's one of its challenges is actually getting buy-in, because people just don't like looking at something that's blatted on the road. It is distressing. So yeah.
Well, you're a pro, Wendy, because definitely the presentation was very sexy from my point of view. I think it very good.
Right.
And I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone did. So thank you so much again. Hopefully we'll get you back and we can continue some more chats. But I've really enjoyed it for one.
Right.
So thank you.
No, my pleasure. And like I said, if anybody wants to email me, I'm more than happy to chat and send them information. But yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing more of your presentations. I mean, I did have a look, and there's some really awesome stuff going on in South Africa that even I had no idea about. So it's great stuff, Roger, that you're doing. Thanks for setting it all up.
I think the exciting thing and the blessing in disguise with the lockdown has meant that we can do stuff like this, and we started to enjoy doing it so much, and have these kind of live streams available to watch on replay and for people to watch at any point, not just live, which is really nice. And I think because of this, and because we're having so much fun doing it, and hopefully you guys are enjoying it as well, that we can continue then, in and out of lockdown as well, and just keep sharing it, which is what the sort of ethos of the Expedition Project was from the start, was to share information, was to tell success stories, was to collaborate and network with as much as possible, and give everyone a chance to sort of share their voice and their stories. And strangely enough, the lockdown has inspired me to sort of do this even more in the way that we're seeing it now, which is great. So thank you so much again. And Terry, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Cool.
And thank you, Wendy.
So next time we're going to join in with Kathy from the Amakola Foundation. That's next Monday at the same time. If you've got any questions, if you're watching this on replay, then do post your questions, and Wendy or myself or Terry can get back to you and answer those questions at any point. So if you are watching this in replay, then please still post your questions. And thank you so much again, everyone. Have a lovely evening, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks, everyone.
Right.
Bye.
Cheers, guys.